In the last episode, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's grand army landed on the shores of Kyushu and aims to not only save the Otomo clan from the Shimazu offensive, but more importantly, to subjugate the island as a whole and bring it entirely into Hideyoshi's sphere of influence. And after a hard-fought campaign, his armies would secure victory, and Kyushu would be brought into the fold. Now, with everything in the south and west in his grasp, Hideyoshi seeks to consolidate his power before turning his gaze east. By 1587, it was clearer now than ever before. The unification of Japan was at hand, and the Sengoku Jidai was nearing its finale. Total peace in the land was just barely out of reach. Truly, there were now none who could afford to stand against the full might of Hideyoshi and all of his allies and vassals. After the reining in of his own clan, which had brought about the assurance of his regime's future stability for a time, and the campaigns that won him dominance over Shikoku and Kyushu, the country was essentially his. The only obstacles that yet remained were in the east and to the north, with his most pressing challenge remaining being the family that had come to dominate the Kanto plains for almost the entirety of the period, the mighty Hojo. Yet, before Hideyoshi was to begin his efforts in dealing with the Hojo, there were other matters on his agenda. Ever since its arrival into feudal Japan, Christianity was always a hot topic. While some fully embraced it, as well as the foreigners who brought it with them, others were still wary of its call. In reality, the addition of Christianity was mere fuel for the chaotic clashes between those who fell under its sway and those who wished to stifle its spread. And largely, we see the most drastic religious altercations taking place on none other than the island of Kyushu, where converted Christian clans such as the Otomo began a form of crusade against the Shinto Buddhist establishment in their domain, destroying temples, shrines, and casting monks and other holy men from their provinces, along with the forced conversion of those under them. All actions which went to disrupt the established order of the country, and were on full display for Hideyoshi as he made his way throughout Kyushu during his campaign in 1587. Hideyoshi was not as taken with the West as his predecessor Oda Nobunaga had been, whereas Nobunaga tolerated Christianity as a means to an end, to solidify Western trade and technology that could help him dominate Japan. Hideyoshi was not nearly as convinced. Records indicate he was still courteous and kind to the foreigners in his country, yet what he saw in Kyushu would force him to take action against the type of behavior that Christian daimyos of Kyushu had been engaging in. In fact, it is even rumored that Hideyoshi looked upon the Christian fervor the same way that he saw the monks of Hongonji. Hideyoshi observed that the main Christian threat on the island was originating from the port city of Nagasaki, where an upper echelon of missionaries had been working to spread the gospel throughout the land, in return for aid from the West. These were his true enemies, not the daimyo who had been swayed by them. He had no qualms with the Otomo and other loyal Christian daimyo, simply the source of the Christian influence in Japan. By tearing out the roots, he believed he could stem the future tide of religious violence throughout the country. By midsummer of 1587, Hideyoshi issued the first Christian expulsion edict, ordering that all foreign Christian elements leave the country with the utmost haste. However, his order was not entirely enforced. Many who converted remained as such, and trade obviously was allowed to continue. Instead, we can see that this order more so acted as a hard warning against further Christian violence and disruption. As in the years to come, religious tension appears to quiet down. His order against the Christians would of course not be the last drastic edict he would give. More were soon to come, and perhaps the most famous of all would occur just 1 year later in 1588. The Sengoku Jidai, Japan's age of warring states, is iconic for a multitude of reasons, most of which obviously relating to the chaotic, violent nature of the period. And it is important to remember that it was not just the samurai and samurai clans engaging in conflicts, but also monks from militant monastic orders, and in many cases, peasantry upon civil unrest and revolt. Hideyoshi had seen much of this strife throughout his life, and once again he would bear witness to yet another uprising in the province of Higo shortly after the end of his conquest of Kyushu. In the last episode, I stated that after Hideyoshi secured Kyushu, Higo passed into the ownership of Kato Kiyomasa and Konishi Yukinaga. This is true, but I neglected to mention that Higo originally had been placed in the hands of another Toyotomi lord first. Sasa Narimasa, a name we have heard before, as he had been a long-running veteran of the Oda clan, yet shortly after Nobunaga's death, he would switch sides to join Ieyasu and take up arms against Hideyoshi during the Komaki Nagakute conflict. Yet in the aftermath, he once again found himself in service to the central regime, and after the fall of Kyushu, he would be given lordship of Higo. Briefly, Narimasa, it appears, was extremely unpopular with the people of Higo, and thus, shortly after he began his governorship, a massive revolt sprung up, one that culminated in the 1587 siege of Tanaka. By this point, Hideyoshi had had enough. Narimasa was stripped of Higo and later ordered to commit seppuku. This is where the province really was handed over to Kiyomasa and Yukinaga. Nevertheless, the more important takeaway I am trying to stress here was the mounting tension between classes and the easy ability for those under the samurai to rise up and rebel. Hideyoshi had taken note of this, and now the top matter on his to-do list became how to deal with conflicts arising from class divide, how to keep those below the samurai in check. In 1588, we have an answer. One of Hideyoshi's most famous yet controversial political edicts. He would come to the decision to ban all weaponry from certain members of the lower classes, particularly farmers and others who were seen as the most troublesome elements. Today, we remember this edict as the sword hunt, but it is again important to highlight that it was not just a massive confiscation of swords, but rather any and all weaponry the lower classes possessed. Thus, all provinces under the influence of the Toyotomi began an extensive campaign to seize swords, daggers, spears, bows, arrows, and any firearms that had made their way into peasant communities. This would work to nullify any chances of insurrection in the future. Of course, this decision did not face criticism and anger from those who were being affected by it. Yet by this point, little could be done to stop the will of Hideyoshi, as thousands of weapons began pouring in. Yet he did try to smooth things over to a degree, making it known that the weapons were not simply being seized for the sake of demilitarizing the lower classes, but instead that the blades from these weapons were in fact going to be melted down and used to construct a great statue of the Buddha, an action he hoped would be seen as a noble endeavor. However, as Hideyoshi continued to press his own future political goals for the nation within the territories he held influence over, there was still obviously the fact that he had yet to fully secure the entire country. And in 1588, talks were beginning to commence between himself and the Hojo. Being one of the most iconic clans of the era, the later Hojo, as they are often referred to, have continued to be a staple power in the East, as we have come to see throughout this series. Ever since the revival of the Hojo name under Ujitsuna, their family had continued to secure new territory and contend with other mighty families in the region, from the Imagawa to the Takeda to the Uesugi to now finally the Tokugawa. Their path had been one of fortitude. In recent years, in aims to secure stability over their domains, in the wake of the fall of the Takeda and Oda Nobunaga's sudden death at Honnoji in 1582, Daimyo Hojo Ujimasa and Tokugawa Ieyasu had forged an alliance. One that, under pressure, would soon face tremendous strain from the overwhelming influence of the growing Toyotomi threat to the west. In 1584, Ieyasu and Hideyoshi fought their legendary clash at Komaki and Nagakute, a bout that served to bring the Tokugawa into closer ties with the Toyotomi. And 1 year later, there would be the famous Toyotomi intervention during the first siege of Ueda that saw the Tokugawa and Hojo both fail to secure territory from the obstinate Sanada clan. This brought about a new souring of relations between the Hojo and Toyotomi. To Ujimasa, it was becoming clearer and clearer that Japan would inevitably come to be dominated by the unquestionable might of Hideyoshi. In 1586, Tokugawa Ieyasu formally traveled to Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi's power base, and pledged full loyalty to him. Although there was still a tremendous amount of distrust between both Ieyasu and Hideyoshi, this formal bond between their factions may be looked upon as a sealing of fate for the country. Obviously, this move was one that placed the Hojo in an interesting position, with their strongest ally now also in league with their largest enemy. What was Ujimasa to do? In 1585, he had watched as Toyotomi forces swept over Shikoku and forced the Chosokabe into submission, and 2 years later, he looked on in displeasure as Kyushu was conquered. In the end, the Hojo remained the final major regional power independent from Hideyoshi's influence. Of course, as always, if Hideyoshi could bring the Hojo under his sphere of influence without war, he would surely wish to do so, as he always used diplomacy before aggression. Twice, Hideyoshi would request the presence of Hojo Ujimasa in the capital, in a bid to have him swear fealty to the Toyotomi. It was an option Ujimasa continued to mull over. He knew bowing before Hideyoshi would save him and his family, along with preserving their long and prestigious legacy his forefathers had established. But to lose his own clan's autonomy was something he also had trouble coming to terms with. Long had the Hojo been safe, guarded behind the Hakone Mountains, a terrain feature that Ujimasa wished to utilize had he ever gone to war against previously the Oda and more recently the Toyotomi. Besides that, the Hojo were mighty, one of the strongest powers in the entire country. In terms of Hideyoshi's enemies, they were one of the most well-off, not lacking in technology and military structure like the Chosokabe, or spread thin like the Shimazu. In fact, after witnessing how the Chosokabe and Shimazu had been treated after their defeat to Hideyoshi, Ujimasa may have felt even more comfortable in defiance, knowing that their clans were still allowed to survive, even with their territory reduced. Ujimasa was pensive, ignoring Hideyoshi's calls and instead sending his brother to the capital, a decision that meant nothing, being that Hideyoshi wanted the appearance of Ujimasa himself. It is said that even Tokugawa Ieyasu, Ujimasa's current friend and ally, continually pleaded with Ujimasa to simply give in to Hideyoshi and avoid a disastrous conflict. Nevertheless, things began to simply fall apart. Hideyoshi could not secure the loyalty of the Hojo, as Ujimasa in the end remained prideful and resilient. War it would be. So, what can we learn? After his conquest of Kyushu, Hideyoshi turned inward to focus on internal dilemmas, namely quelling the tide of violent religious unrest, along with revolts from the lower class. In 1588, he would issue his edict signaling the commencement of his famous sword hunt, a campaign that sought to seize any and all weaponry from the lower classes, in the end melting them down to aid in the construction of a great Buddha. Later, he would finally turn his gaze back outwards to look upon what seemed to be his final campaign in his aims of total unification of Japan. His target would be the Hojo clan of Kanto, led by Hojo Ujimasa, who would in the end resist Hideyoshi's attempts to bring him into the fold. In the next episode, Hideyoshi's final major war in Japan begins, as the Hojo will try desperately to halt the Toyotomi advance. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.